Hello! We're going to now take a look at Tony Morris and his career as one of Jehovah's Witnesses over the years. Basically, what I'm going to do is construct a timeline by merging four sources. The two Watchtower articles about him that I cited in the first video, public records that anybody can get on county websites, that kind of thing, and then finally background check type info from Google and other sites that do that type of thing. Now recall that Tony returned from Vietnam in 1970 at a very turbulent time in American history. On the ExJW Fifth YouTube channel, Fifth has a great interview with a therapist, Dr. Fusco. I'll link it in the description below. But she commented on how many Americans at that time were turning to gurus, to cults, religions of all sorts.
Smart people all the time. I think the older you get, the less likely you are because you've just seen more life. And especially my generation, because we saw this flurry of cults after Vietnam, after Watergate, after our turmoil in the 60s and 70s. The civil rights movement was huge. And there were cults that flourished after that because we're trying to redefine ourselves as a nation. And God forbid I should have to spend years figuring out whom I am. Much easier to have someone tell me for me. Yeah, smart people should help. Yeah.
It's a little broken up there, but a couple of times she says, smart people join cults. And that makes sense, you know. If a cult or a group can last more than a few years, it's because it's learned to be very persuasive, very appealing to people. If you're drawn to logic, they can appeal to that. If love among its members is what you like, they can show you that too. These are very persuasive groups. And so Tony was one person that was seeking answers from religion. He was living in the West Palm Beach, Florida area, visiting a lot of churches. Nothing really jumped out at him until he visited the Kingdom Hall in Delray Beach. He liked how the little kids were looking up the scriptures in their Bibles. So he accepted a Bible study from Jim Gardner, an older witness there, who professed to be of one of the 144,000. In fact, Jim would tell Tony about how he knew personally Charles Taze Russell, the founder of the Bible students, who would become Jehovah's Witnesses. Tony started studying with the witnesses at a time of big excitement in the organization. The year 1975 was being highlighted as a very significant year in Bible chronology. A year where there was a good chance Armageddon might come, followed by paradise. Maybe, probably. So there was big growth in the number of people joining the witnesses at that time, and those that were already witnesses were really active, really zealous in the ministry. One thing you can say about Tony, he was not half-hearted when he joined the witnesses. In just a few weeks, he qualified as an unbaptized publisher. Like many other new witnesses, Tony made the mistake of telling his family about what he was learning without too much finesse. He writes, quote, I boldly but bluntly preached to them. I forcefully shared the truth with them. I later had to apologize for my insensitive manner, unquote. His parents actually asked him to leave their condo he'd been staying in. He no doubt attended the memorial, which was on April 9th that year. And after that, he left Florida in May to head back to Michigan because he had money up in a savings account there. This was the pre-ATM era. He mentions witnessing on Interstate 75 on the drive up there. If you look at a map, I-75 actually runs the entire way from Florida straight into Saginaw, so it makes sense that that road would be burned into his memory. We find him next in July, and he's in New York City at the Divine Name District Assembly at Yankee Stadium. That's where he gets baptized. It's also around this time, probably, that he becomes acquainted with Susan Kettle, who would become the future Mrs. Morris. Maybe they met at the assembly? Not sure. But we find him next dating Susan in Cranston, Rhode Island, which is where she lived. They got married in December, and at that point both of them are putting in 100 hours a month preaching as regular pioneers. It's kind of funny when you think that they met, they dated, and they got married in just a few months, basically. Tony was a brother only baptized 6 months when they got married. It's interesting because in one talk he advised single sisters to really be selective in who they choose to marry. that the brother, he said, should at least be a ministerial servant. So, was Tony a ministerial servant when he got married? I mean, becoming one only 6 months after baptism seems pretty quick to have happened, but on the other hand, things were moving pretty fast in that pre-1975 era, so who knows, I guess. So they're pioneering in Rhode Island, and we find them next in the year 1975. As we know, nothing at all stupendous happened that year. Armageddon in the paradise did not come. And so the Morrises decide to take a little bit of a breather, step off this treadmill of full-time service, going 110% all the time. So they both stop pioneering, and they start a family. That's the year their first son Jesse is born. And that's really just reflective of what many witnesses did in that post-1975 time frame. There was a general slowdown in the organization. Pioneers dropped. There was about a net decrease of around 15,000 pioneers in that 75-76 era. And so Tony and Susan were just two of many pioneers that came off the list. So their son Jesse is born in 75. We see they picked a good Bible name there for him. And then in 1977, their second son, Paul A. Morris, is born. Again, picking a good Bible name, Paul, as loyal witnesses tend to do. They couldn't use the name Anthony since that's not a Bible name, but Paul's middle initial is A, so I wonder if they used Anthony as his middle name to kind of keep this chain of Anthonys going. In 1979, Tony starts pioneering again. And this, too, reflects the general trend among witnesses, where around by that 1980-ish time, the zeal had started to bounce back. The disappointment about nothing happening in 75 had kind of worn off by then. It's interesting that Susan doesn't start pioneering again until both the boys are in school. So maybe 82, 83-ish. It's a little unusual where the husband would be pioneering but the wife isn't. Usually it's the other way around for witnesses. It'd be interesting to know what he was doing for work in Rhode Island up there. He must have had a pretty flexible schedule to be able to pioneer. I'm not sure if he kept going with the medical field or if he went to something else. In 1980, Susan's father, Forrest, died. And then in 1986, Susan's mother, Florence, died. Florence was actually living with Susan and Tony at their home in Narragansett, Rhode Island, so they were helping take care of her when she passed away. So after both of Susan's parents had died, the Morrises had more freedom to increase their theocratic activity. And so it was that the following year, in 1987, that the family moved to North Carolina to serve where the need was great. It was some point after they moved south that Tony began serving as a substitute circuit overseer. It was also during this time that Jesse and Paul joined their parents in the regular pioneer work. The Morrises pop up next in 1990 when they bought a house in Lumberton, North Carolina. So this is one of the documents of them buying that house at 1418 East 7th Street. Here's their mortgage paperwork. This is the earliest document I've seen in which Tony refers to himself as Anthony Morris III. It'd be interesting to see how he signed it on his marriage license, but those records aren't public for the first 50 years. So in 2022, someone can check it out. We see it's a 30-year mortgage for $44,000. It's interesting that it looks like they used a VA loan from the Veterans Administration. So they were okay with using some of the benefits of having served in the military. Honestly, I think many witnesses feel similarly. So many just don't have well-paying jobs, and they kind of need every advantage they're eligible for. Here we see their signatures. Again, Tony signs as the third. Susan, it looks like Susan might be a lefty from her signature. Just going by his birth date, it's probably around 1991-ish that Jesse, their firstborn, graduates from high school. In 92, we see Tony pop up as one of the trustees of the East Congregation in Lumberton. Here it looks like the congregation is buying some property. Around 1993-ish, their younger son Paul probably graduated himself from high school. It's also in this year that Tony and Susan sell their Lumberton house and they pay off the mortgage. Here's some paperwork from the sale. And here we see their mortgage paid off. So at some point in this kind of 93 to 98 time period is when the Morrises start serving full-time as circuit overseers. It's kind of funny when you think that it's been a good 20, 25 years now that Jehovah's Witnesses have been paying to support the Morrises all that time. The last time Tony worked secularly would have been around when Windows 95 came out. Well, Tony wrote that both his boys went to Bethel at 19, which is the minimum age. So it would have been in 94 that Jesse heads off to Bethel. In 95, Tony pops up again as a congregation trustee, this time for the West Congregation in Lumberton. Here it looks like the congregation is selling the Kingdom Hall to the Happy Hill Word of Deliverance Fellowship. In 96, their younger son Paul heads off to Bethel himself. In 1998, they get a new circuit assignment on Long Island, New York City. Their address there is a circuit overseer apartment in Eastport. After 3 years, they get another new circuit assignment, this time in Hampton County, Massachusetts. Their address again is a circuit overseer apartment in Holyoke, so that would be in 2000. Now the next few moves are Tony's ascension to the governing body. So we need to mention that at some point after his baptism, Tony has become a partaker at the memorial. He feels that he is one of the 144,000 anointed that will be going to heaven when they die, to rule as kings and priests with Jesus Christ over the earth. You know, it's interesting to think back to Tony's Bible teacher, Jim Gardner, there in Florida. Remember, Tony started studying in February, and the memorial in 71 was on April 9th. So almost certainly he attended his very first memorial with Jim, and Jim himself professed to be of the anointed. It must have been kind of exciting for Tony to sit with Jim, or I don't know, maybe being anointed, Jim was giving the talk. But either way, Tony could observe him being one of the few in the Kingdom Hall that partook of the wine and the unleavened bread. And so at some point, Tony concluded that, just like his teacher, he too was anointed. He'd be seeing Jim again, but this time when they're ruling together in heaven as kings. Now, since the circuit overseer often generally gives the memorial talk each year wherever he's at, it would be very obvious to the audience that Tony was a partaker, because everybody would see him up on stage eating and drinking the bread and wine. So no doubt the higher-ups in the Watchtower organization were quickly aware that, hey, there's a circuit overseer that's anointed. That's an important thing because you have to be anointed to be on the governing body. And so it's for that reason that after their 3 years in Massachusetts, the Morrises did not receive a new circuit assignment in 2002. Instead, Tony was pulled off the road and assigned to work in the service department at Patterson-Bethel. And specifically, he eventually began working as a helper to the service committee of the governing body. So for Tony, this was essentially a pretty nice promotion. Now, for Susan, on the other hand, it was a little different. And that's because there's no leadership roles for women among Jehovah's Witnesses. So her reward for Tony's promotion was that she had to start working in the laundry department. I'd be curious to know what she thought about that change. I mean, circuit work itself is pretty stressful. You're on the road almost every week. But I'm not sure whether it was an improvement that here she's over 50 years old, she has to start working in a laundry full time. Tony writes that she really loved it, but I'd be curious to get her thoughts on the matter. Unfortunately, the odds are not real good that we'll get her thoughts. I took a quick peek through the publications index, and over the past 59 years, there have been life stories published of 21 men that have served as governing body members, which I think is pretty much all of them. However, in the same 59-year period, we find life stories of only 3 of the wives of governing body members. Yeah, so I guess we'll just have to keep our fingers crossed that Susan gets published eventually. In 2005, Tony officially joins the governing body, and so he and Susan moved to Brooklyn Bethel. In 2010, his stepfather, Victor Grasmick, passes away. And in 2013, his mother, Shirley, dies. In 2016, the Morrises moved to Warwick Bethel once it was completed. And so if you Google them today, their current address is 40 Kings Drive in Tuxedo Park, New York. And that's simply the street address of Warwick Bethel there. One thing I got a kick out of is that in my Googling around, I found where Susan had left a review for a consignment store in Warwick. I'm pretty sure it's her. I assume there aren't an overabundance of Susan Morrises in Tuxedo Park. So here's the review she left. Very glowing review. So, next time you're up visiting Warwick Bethel, you may want to pop into the Savvy Chic Boutique. Recommended by a family member of the governing body. Well, that pretty much brings us up to date on the history of the Morrises as Jehovah's Witnesses. In the next video, we'll take a look at whether Tony came from a wealthy family, which is something he's mentioned before in talks. So stay tuned. Until then, thanks for watching. Take care.